everybody. We'll begin this press conference
du film Romeria,
for the film Romeria by the director, the Spanish director, Carla. Thank you very much for being here today. First of all, I would like to interest the team, the crew. Of course, Carla in the middle of the table, the Spanish director, who made Romeria, which is her third film after summer 1993, which spoke about a little girl welcomed into a family after her parents died, and also Alcaraz,
qui a été dans un autre grand festival de cinéma,
which
qui a gagné
was selected for
le
another
prix
major
majeur,
festival,
et
and
il
it won
raconte
the top award.
l'histoire d'une
It
famille de
talks about the
cultivateurs de
story
pêche qui est obligée de
of
quitter
farmers who
ses terres.
grew
On accueille aussi la
peaches
comédienne, la
and
jeune
had to leave
comédienne
their
Lucia
land.
Garcia.
I'd like to welcome the
dans
young
le rôle
actor,
de Marina.
Lucia
Vous pouvez
Garcia, who's
l'applaudir, bien
Marina in the
évidemment.
film. She deserves a round of applause, of course. Welcome here.
Le comédien Mitch aussi, qui
the
fait le
actor
cousin
as well,
de Marina.
who's Marina's
Et
cousin.
nous avons également la
And we
directrice de la
also
photographie,
have
Hélène
the
Louvard.
DOP, Hélène Louvard.
Merci beaucoup, bienvenue. Et la
And we'd like to
productrice
welcome
du film
and the producer
espagnol,
of the
Maria
film,
Zamora.
Maria Zamora.
Et nous allons aussi accueillir
And
quelques
I'd
personnes qui
also
sont
like
au
to welcome
premier
some other
rang.
people
Olympia
who are sitting right
Ponchafer
at
de
the
Vental
front.
Cinema.
Olivier
Je peux l'applaudir.
from Vental Cinema.
Masculin de Dos Soles Media.
Dos Soles Media.
Et deux responsables du son
The
de ce
person in
film,
charge of
Alejandro
sound,
Castillo
Alejandro
et Eva
Castillo
Valigno.
and Eva Valigno.
Voilà, merci beaucoup. Donc on va commencer, c'est
So
moi
we'll
qui ai
get going now, and I have the privilege of asking the first
Et
question.
donc je voulais commencer par
I
le
would
titre
like to
justement de ce
begin by the
film,
title of the film,
Romeria, qui fait
Romeria,
référence en
which
Espagne
refers
à
in
une
Spain
pèlerination, un pèlerinage
to
religieux.
pilgrimage, a religious
Et ça
pilgrimage.
parle d'une histoire familiale,
The
dramatique.
film
Je
talks
voulais
about a
savoir
family
pour Carla
story, which is
Simone,
quite dramatic,
est-ce
and I'd like to
que
ask
ce
Carla
film a été
Simone
pour toi
whether this film for you
vers l'histoire de
was
ta
a
famille?
pilgrimage back to the story of your family.
Bueno, buenos días.
Well,
Bonjour.
first of all, good morning.
Sí, o sea,
Yes, indeed.
Romería tiene como este
Romeria
significado
does have
místico,
that
¿no? De la palabra
mystical
que hace religioso,
meaning.
de hacer
It's a
un
very
viaje.
religious
Y yo creo que el
word
viaje que
that
hace
refers to
Marina tiene
a
mucho de
trip, and I
místico
think
para entender
Marina's
sus
trip
raíces, pero también
is
como
very
para
mystical as
conectarse,
well, because
pues,
she has
emocionalmente
to,
con sus
emotionally
padres, con la historia de
speaking,
amor que ellos
reconnect with
vivieron,
her
entender,
parents,
bueno, pues,
reconnect
cómo fue esa
with
historia, ¿no?
her
Y luego
childhood.
tiene otro
That's the story.
significado
And there's also another
que descubrí
meaning
más
to the
tarde,
word,
que es el
which
significado
came a
que se
bit
usa más
later
como en el
on.
norte de España,
As
que
we're
es
talking
fiesta
about the
popular.
northern
Y
part
como
of
a mí me gustan mucho
Spain,
las fiestas
I
populares
love
y
popular
creo que, pues, también salen en la película y tienen algo como
parties,
de la
festivities,
tradición,
and I
¿no?
wanted to depict this in the
Que me gusta
film,
mucho
these
retratar,
traditions.
pues,
I love to
pues
portray this
también como
kind
de
of
alguna manera
situation.
encajaba en la
So
película.
the film also refers to that meaning.
Passer en espagnol direct. Je
Sorry,
dois parler en
I was
français,
about
pardon.
to put my
Avec
question in
Romeria,
Spanish
tu abordes
with Romeria.
un épisode
You broach
tragique de
a
ton
very
histoire
tragic
familiale.
episode in your family history.
C'est l'histoire de tes parents.
The history of your
Mais
parents.
jusqu'à quel point ce
Their
film il
story.
est autobiographique?
Is the
Et à
film
quel moment tu utilises la
autobiographical?
fiction
And
pour
when did you start
recomposer ce
using
puzzle
fiction
familial?
to to put together again this family background, this family
Pues hay
story?
mucha ficción.
Well,
Hay mucha ficción porque sí que
there's
es verdad que yo
a
conocía
lot of
parte de mi
affection there.
familia
I knew
paterna, pues cuando tenía más o
my
menos
father's
la edad
side of
de
the
Lucia.
family because we
Pero no
have
toda.
this
Y los
portrayed by
conocí en Madrid
Lucia,
porque
but I didn't
algunos
know
estaban viviendo en Madrid.
everything.
Y este
And
viaje
this
a
trip,
Galicia lo hice un poco
well,
más tarde, ¿no?
this trip was
Entonces,
something
bueno,
that
es
was
como
done a
que
bit later
yo creo que
on.
hay algo de mis emociones que sentía y de mi
Some of
curiosidad.
my emotions in the film, my curiosity and my frustration, because what I really wanted to do was try to understand in depth what my parents' story was, because there was no one there to really tell me about it, and that was a driving force behind the film. You have this family history depicted in a very short period. My family is bigger than what you see in the film, so it's not all autobiographical, in fact. The characters equally are fictional characters, because it was very important to ensure that the story worked. The film also talks about the AIDS epidemic and how it was experienced in Spain. It was a bit special in that country. Could you perhaps say a bit more about that, say a bit more about those years when there was AIDS? It was quite dramatic, but in Spain there were some special ingredients. Yes, it's very strange, in fact, because AIDS is a different story depending on the country. I don't know, in the US, for example, it was very much linked to homosexuality. In the UK, it was very much linked to the African community. And in Spain, it was very much linked to heroin addicts. It was a period of transition after so many years of dictatorship when Franco finally died. And then people wanted to feel that they'd been set free. People didn't talk too much about drugs and AIDS, but there was a lot of drugs circulating, and young people who'd been in political opposition were indulging in drugs. And it was hard to put a break on this, which proved absolutely devastating. At the time, young people didn't know the consequences of drug addiction, not in the same way that we know now. And through AIDS, a lot of people in Spain died. In fact, it was a country with one of the highest death rates. And I realized that this was not just my own personal tale or that of my parents. There was so much sadness, so much grieving owing to AIDS. And people stopped talking about them. I think it was very important to dig up these memories. This generation, in a way, did things back to front. In fact, changed the values of society in a very broad manner. And this is something I wanted to depict. I have a question for the two actors in the film. Thank you very much. I'll start with Lucia. You are the pillar in the film. How did you approach this character who discovers part of her family and ends up in discovering even the secret parts of this family, which everyone tried to hide?
Bueno, hicimos 3 meses de ensayos. Entonces,
we rehearsed for about 3 months.
Claro, era complicado
and it was very complicated to portray this character. Carla wanted to improvise to a degree. It was very special when we were rehearsing because we had to keep adding in different components. Marina, well, I remember she gets angry with her father. She expresses the fact that she's fairly fed up, and this was very difficult for me to portray. I really had to get into the character. And for you, Mitch, what was your approach to your character and the story told in this film? It's set in the present, but it talks about Spain and this AIDS epidemic in the past.
Pues,
well,
tuve la suerte también de juntarme con
I
Peña, que
felt
conocí
I
en
was
Vigo,
very
que
fortunate to be able to
había
join the film that
enganchado
worked on the
a la
team.
heroína,
And
y que me
we
contasen
have
también ellos
the
sus
issue
experiencias
of heroin
personales
addiction, which hark back to some of my
como
personal memories,
son
in fact.
supervivientes de esa
And
época
I wanted to try and identify with those who survived the epidemic at the time, who indulged in heroin consumption. I prepared for the character a lot during the rehearsals, and I wanted really to get under my character's skin. Could we perhaps now move on to the questions? We have a question here. Hello.
Buen día, buenos días. Felicidades por la
Congratulations on your film.
De la web París-Barcelona.
I come from Barcelona and Radio Barcelona. I will ask my question in Spanish, but perhaps you could answer in Catalan.
realmente te enfrentas en esta tercera película a
This
lo
is
más
your
directo
third
a
film.
nivel
It's
familiar
perhaps
y
the one that
te vas fuera de
directly
Cataluña, te vas a
addresses
Galicia
family matters.
y afrontas una época también
You
complicada,
are
como
dealing
decíais
with a
ahora.
very complicated
¿Qué es lo que
time
más
in
te ha
Spanish
costado
history.
para
What was
enfrentarte
most
a esta
difficult
película?
when it
Y
came
una
to
vez la has
making
hecho,
this film?
ahora
And once
que
you made the
sabes,
film,
ha sido un sitio también rural como
now
Galicia,
that it has
o
been
marítimo o
screened,
rural, ahora que ayer
now
hubo el pase y
that
tuvo la
you
buena,
have
la
seen
buena acogida
the
que
film
tuvo,
and you saw
ahora
how warmly it
cómo te
was welcomed,
sientes
how do
después
you
de haber hecho
actually
este
feel
esfuerzo. Y
now
para
that you
Lucia,
made this
como
huge
es su
effort?
primer papel,
And for
¿esto
Lucia,
te ha
it's your
beneficiado?
first part.
O
Did you
al revés,
learn a
te
lot
ha
through it,
puesto el nivel
or
muy alto después del
on the
recibimiento
contrary,
que
did
tuvisteis
it
ayer?
entail a tremendous
¿Tienes
effort?
previsto continuar? Si
And do
podeu
you
contestar
plan
en
to
català molt ben
continue
determinat, us
in
ho
this
agraeixo.
profession?
Perquè és a nivell personal, dius,
Personally speaking,
o a nivell de repte de la pel·lícula en general, no?
do you want me to answer personally or in terms of the challenge that I took up when making this film?
Clar, o sigui, a nivell personal,
On a personal level,
m'afrontava com a una part de la família que realment conec molt
I had
poquet,
to
no? O sigui,
deal
que
with
són
part
ells,
of the
però,
family
estan
that
al
I
costat,
didn't really know very well.
d'Espanya i no els coneixia molt, llavors sí que doncs vaig fer un
I
exercici
wasn't
també com de
familiar
parlar amb ells i
with these
aquestes
members of the
coses,
family because they lived on the other
però que
side
també
of
ha
Spain.
necessitat com prendre certa distància per entendre, per poder explicar aquesta història com no és només la meva història, sinó la de molta
However,
gent i poder
at the same time, I did have to create a given distance because the story I tell in the film is not the same as mine. Of course, the characters go on a voyage of discovery, but what I tried to do in the film was to create a fiction. When it comes to the making of the film, what proved most difficult was més estricte, no?, de les altres pel·lícules, i d'aquí una mica com aquesta segona part de la pel·lícula que vol acabar un lloc més poètic, que sempre, I try to make things look as natural as possible usually when I make a film, but in this film you have this poetic dimension. I didn't know whether the public would follow me on this voyage of discovery, and in fact I found it a very positive to see the excellent reaction of the public when the film was screened.
A una pel·lícula quan no has fet... Sí, enfrontar-se a una pel·lícula quan no has fet mai abans res, això és un avantatge o és un desavantatge?
Was it an advantage or not to take up such a complex matter? What we did, in fact, was to make this film in such a way that it was an advantage, a real privilege. In other words, this was really the film that you wanted to make. At the beginning, I didn't even feel I was acting. I felt I was just living certain situations and experiences. I really became Marina. It was a gradual process, of course, with all the rehearsals that we held. I was given a lot of support throughout the process.
És nou i és molt extravagant i no sé com encaixar-ho. Llavors, sorpresa, encara no sé. A poc a poc.
So I don't know what I'll do subsequently to answer your question. Congratulations on this marvelous film. Carla, I belong to your mother's generation to a degree, so I had the feeling that this film talks about a given moment in time in Spain that was sort of erased by Almodovar and others. Could you tell us when you realized that there was not just your family, it's a drama, the AIDS and heroin drama, was sort of erased from people's memory. How did you go about dealing with this subject? It's a very important moment in time, politically speaking. And did you feel you had to settle scores? Well, in fact, as I have always felt very happy within my restricted family. We talked about a lot of things together, and up until my first film, which deals a lot with AIDS as well, it's then that I realized, of course, that my family history was shared by many other people, because a lot of people came to tell me, well, this was what I went through too. And through my characters, I realized that this was a very widespread phenomenon. Also, people the age of my parents said this was a bit shocking. You showed this in such an open manner. My parents died of AIDS, of course, and my aunts and uncles had also experienced this in a very negative way. They didn't usually talk about what happened. And when we decided to make Romeria, one of the reasons was that we wanted to conjure up these historic memories. And it's the sadness of these families is depicted. You can share it, empathize with them. So many people were hit directly or indirectly by AIDS. I believe, therefore, that in the film, we're talking about a time, not just the film, but there are lots of books coming out now on the same topic, and they're placing this generation into context. It was a key generation. It was sort of a lost generation. Next question.
Conchita Casanovas, de Radio Nacional de España.
Spanish National Radio. I'd like to ask Carla, I don't know whether you're aware of the fact, but I think you've wrought a miracle. You've turned death into life through this film. I'd like to ask you what was most difficult for you during this trip, this voyage. What was the most difficult time and the most satisfactory time when tackling this issue of turning death into life? Well, for me, it's always been very important to tell this story in a very positive way. Of course, we could have had a person, a character who was very angry with her family. That would have been one of the possibilities. She could have reproached them with the absence of love. But that's not the case in this character. It's a question of curiosity. The person doesn't have any conflict, simply wants to know about the past history of her family. This made the film very interesting for me because it focuses more on curiosity, trying to understand one's family's past history. And in this way, it's a very in-depth voyage of discovery. And with the entire crew, with all the members of the crew, we wanted to find the right tone for telling this tale in the film, without making it overly romantic or overly dramatic. It was a tough challenge to rise to. How can you tell a story that you haven't actually experienced personally, but you've heard so many people talk about? It was a delicate balancing act.
Hola, buenos días. Enhorabuena.
Good morning.
Soy Xinxue, periodista de China.
I come from China. I loved your film. I have a question for Lucia Garcia. What was it like working on the film with the other members of the cast? I'd like to know how you viewed this experience. What were the challenges? What were the most difficult parts in this film? Thank you.
I start and you follow. Sí. Bueno, a mí me apetecía mucho ese cambio de escenario,
I really
¿no? Después
liked
de
all
haber
these
rodado
changes
dos
of
películas
scene,
en muy
moving
rural,
from
de
one
repente
film to
salir
another.
al
One was in a
mar
very
daba algo
rural
como de
area,
libertad que tenía
and
mucho que ver con la
then
película,
we
con mi padre.
filmed a lot the sea, which has a direct link with my parents, of course. And it's a specific place you see in the film. I think it's very special. The actual locations were a sort of a thread that enabled me to connect with his entire story. So filming in this manner, in these places, entailed quite a lot of technical challenges. The boats, some of them were very small, the light, the sea. These are all things we had to accommodate during the filming. So how did we broach this technical challenge? Well, it was very important to master the right technique and ensure that all the characters felt free and at ease. We found ways and means to achieve our goals. It wasn't very easy, of course, and in a nutshell, it was a very positive experience. Yes, indeed. If you want to compare the rural areas and the sea, the ports, the boats, the islands, these are all invitations to travel. And in the film, it depicts a sort of a trip. From a technical stance, we had to shoot scenes in the boats. Of course, we were actually in the port. You had to have the right lighting. A lot of scenes were in the evening, for example. And when we filmed during the day and we were on board a boat, it was great. We found the right way with our cameras to ensure that we were able to accommodate what we wanted to achieve with a very small team. It was more complicated than when we were on land. So the boat, the island, that enabled us. It actually gave me great liberty because movement is an important component of the film. We wanted the scenes to appear very fluid and not static in any manner.
Buenos días y enhorabuena a todo el equipo creativo por la película. Yo soy Martín de Barcelona.
I come from Barcelona. I'd like to ask you, Carla, what was it like doing this project? You have a huge contrast between memories and the things that are handed down from one generation to another, and creation. How did you cope with this contrast? Well, I thought a lot about how memory actually works, and it's very fascinating. I worked on this when making the film. When you remember something, you don't remember really what happened. You remember the last memory of the event. So it's a sort of a game within our own memories, our own personal memories. And that also shows us that we had to, we adapted to all these things that happened in the past. That's the sine qua non for surviving in life. When I asked my family about my parents, for example, they told me different things sometimes with the same story. Sometimes, depending on the protagonist, the story was a bit different. Well, your mother did this, for example, your father did that. So it was a very difficult exercise. It was tough to find just one way of telling the story. Sometimes what I realized was that people told me things about my parents, but it was not really what happened. And this is something we had to depict in the film. The cinema is very powerful because it enables you to shape your own tale. It enables you to conjure up these images you don't actually have in your mind, you don't have access to. So for me, it was wonderful to put pictures, images to things written by my mother. She had a diary, for example. She wrote a lot of things also to her friends. And for me, this was very poetic. I could almost hear her speaking. So that enabled me, in fact, to draw very close to these memories, these words, the way of talking. And in the end, that's what I based myself on when making the film, which talks about a different period of time. So what I tried to do was to put images to these tales, and that's the strength of the filmmaking as a creative art. You talked about the sea and people and your mother. I have a question. To what extent is this story a voyage in Spain, which is very different depending on the region? Marina goes from Catalonia to Galicia. She changes language. Catalan in Catalonia and then Spanish. The seas are very different. You move from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. Were you also aware of this in your film? You wanted to depict these differences in this trip across Spain? Yes, indeed. It, I think, was very beautiful to discover Galicia for all the crew members. For me, Galicia has a mystical dimension. It's the place where my parents lived their love story. And also you have the impression it's very poetical, Galicia. The rivers are very special. The rivers which then run into the sea, and it's hard to control them. For us, it was quite a discovery. The landscape is extremely distinctive, and you have this part of the film where we use a video camera, in fact, when we film Marina. And this also, for me, was a very direct way of establishing a link with these spaces, these places. These spaces, the places remain when people come and go. It's very beautiful and frustrating at the same time because you don't really know whether to focus more here or there, but we struck on the right way to film these spaces and these characters. For me, the characters were very creative, the process was creative, and I felt deeply inspired by both the characters and the very empty spaces, the empty landscapes, using this video camera.
Good morning, buenos dias. My name is Chaz Ebert from RogerEbert.com in Chicago. You made a very beautiful and poetic film. Families are very invested in holding their secrets close to the vest. One thing I was a little confused about was Lucia playing both her character as the cousin, and also, was that the same person, or was that a different woman playing her as her mother, also with Mitch? Was that a double role as well? Was he both the father and the cousin? I couldn't tell quite.
Yes, they did both. And that was a big challenge for them acting-wise. But the idea is that, you know, like, she arrives in this country, in this part of Spain, without knowing so much about her parents, and she doesn't even have many pictures of them. So when you try to imagine, and you don't have these images, you imagine through what you have, no? And she arrives, actually, she films these spaces, she kind of, when she imagines, she sees the images that she's filmed, or the places where she's been, or the stories that she's been told. And also, she imagines her mom and her dad as herself and her cousin, because she likes her cousin a little bit. So it's a way to kind of recreate this love story, basically out of like the lack of images that she has of her parents. No, like, I have few photos of them. So if I have to try to imagine something, I don't know how they moved, how they, no, it's so hard to kind of put images in like their bodies. So I think that it's something kind of natural that you imagine through what you know, and even like through what you would like to feel in your own skin, no? So that's why the choice of like them becoming the parents was, for me, very clear, I think, from the very beginning of the writing of the script.
Moi, j'avais une question sur les secrets de famille.
I have a question about family secrets.
Et je le disais à quelqu'un qui m'a posé la question hier. En fait, l'Amérique latine, c'est pareil.
In Latin America, it's similar. One can connect with these characters who are sort of lost sheep, who you try to hide. And I'd like to ask each of you, including Marina, to what extent this film reflected this characteristic of Spanish families. People try to hide the black sheep in the family. You can't show the black sheep in society. Indeed, in this case in particular, and it of course happens in many, many
sur de Europa y
families,
también Latinoamérica, muy tendentes a estar
Spain,
muy
like
en
in Latin
el centro
America,
o en el núcleo de la
and
familia durante toda nuestra vida, ¿no? Hay otros países
throughout
que te separas más
people's
fácilmente.
lives, they've
Pero yo
tended
creo que en
to
este
hide
caso, en esta
the
historia
black sheep.
específica, toda
In
esta
the case
parte
of this
de,
specific
bueno, de
story,
esconder, de no contar,
this
tiene
idea
que
of
ver
not
mucho con
saying
el
anything,
tabú que
hiding
supuso
things,
esta enfermedad
it's
y esta,
linked to
bueno,
the
que decía
taboo
de
about
la
AIDS
droga, ¿no? Esta
and the use of
epidemia de
drugs.
la droga que tuvo lugar en España,
You
que
had
como
this AIDS
llegó
epidemic,
de una
this
forma
drug
tan
epidemic
repentina,
in
fue muy
France,
desconocida al principio, los
which
efectos que podía
wasn't
tener
well
y los
known to
estragos
begin with.
que
People
supuso para
didn't
toda
know
una
about it.
generación.
They
Entonces yo
didn't
creo
realize
que
that
también
drug
eso
abuse would
es
have
un conflicto
such
tan fuerte el que supuso
lead to so
para
many
para
negative
todas esas
sequelae.
familias que,
And for all these
bueno,
families, they
que se
tended to
decidió
hide the
esconder. O
fact.
sea, es como el
They felt
más
happier
grande aún que los
hiding it.
secretos, ¿no? normales de la familia.
It was
Entonces
more
se
than
hace-
just a
se
normal
hace aún
family
más
secret.
evidente
It
esta
was
parte de esconder.
something much bigger that they felt they had to hide. And you, Mitch, how did you view this? The family side? Yes, I agree entirely. I think in all families, not just in Spanish families, I think all families tend to hide certain truths and they lie about them, not for the wrong reasons, but they just want to hide certain things that have been done. They prefer to believe in a different reality. They'd rather really not know about what really happened. Everyone has its own personal world that they try to protect, and in Spain this is something that often happens in many Spanish families.
Bueno, o sea, yo creo que tiene mucho sentido que pase eso con las familias.
Yes, I
cuando,
think this does
creo que
often
lo he dicho varias
happen in
veces,
families
Cuando no las coges, ¿no? Pero tampoco podría aquí hacer todo un
which
discurso antropológico,
choose what they
pero-
want to reveal and what they wish to hide. Thank you. So to finish, we were talking about reconstitution, the family and history. To finish, we were talking about the family and how one can reconstitute history through art. Carla, did you have the feeling through your life story that you ticked all the boxes that were missing in this puzzle thanks to this film?
Sí, bueno,
Yes.
un poco era como, o sea, como hacer una especie, no homenaje, pero sino
It wasn't
como de recordar
a
esta
homage or a tribute. It was a way of talking about this lost generation which nobody talked about. And in Galicia, you can see it in the film. There's a photo with lots of people, and you see that only a couple of them are still alive because it was a huge scourge at the time. A lot of young people were dying. Many people said to me that every end of the week there was another burial because of AIDS. And there were a lot of accidents. There were a lot of accidents linked to AIDS and drugs. And I wanted to depict this generation and put it back in the circumstances of the time. That's what I tried to go about doing in my film. I don't know whether there are any other questions in the room. If not, I noted the soundtrack of the film. There is a reference to a very well-known rock group which dates from the 80s. You mix together this very modern music with traditional Galician music. Would you like to say something about the musical tradition in Spain?
Sí.
Yes.
Sí, a ver, la música de los 80 fue
In the
muy potente en
80s,
España, ¿no? Y había varios
the
grupos
group was
que
very
salieron
well
de
known
Vigo.
in
De
Spain,
hecho,
and there were a number of pop groups
bueno,
as
mucha
well
gente decía
who
que
acquired
Vigo y Madrid
a
eran
lot of
como ciudades
notoriety.
hermanas, ¿no? Que en Madrid
And
había toda
in
esa movida,
Madrid,
pero que en Vigo también
you had
había
this
mucha movida,
movement
y en parte es gracias
in
como a la
addition
música, ¿no?
to other
Entonces,
big
esta
cities.
canción que escogimos
This
es de
song
Siniestro
that
Total.
we
Y
chose
bueno, para
is
mí
very
había
typical
algo
of the time.
que tenía mucho
For me,
sentido, que en algún
it it was very meaningful when this song came out. And of course, in my imagination, I imagined it as more poetic than it perhaps is. We worked a lot with the sound engineer to try and bring together all these ideas that are depicted in these traditional songs as well. The traditional songs are like a kind of a legend in Galicia. They're part of the regional history, and people believe there are spirits in the forest that never die. People tend to believe these tales and sing about them. So suddenly I thought we could refer to these spirits that never die, because it was a necessity in the film. It was an idea of the idea of dying in peace, and we wanted to depict this choreography and these dances together with the music. So on this musical note, I think we'll put an end to this press conference, and thank you very much for attending.